I still remember the phone call. The kind of call that doesn't just wake you up, but rips your world apart. It was March 3, 2010. My mother, Barbara Beach Hamburg, had been murdered outside her home in Madison, Connecticut. To say those words still feels unreal. My mother was murdered. For years, I thought I'd have time to fix things between us. The arguments, the distance, the little moments I thought I could make up for later. But later never came. Instead, I was left with silence, questions, and a family fractured in ways I couldn't imagine. And yet, even in that silence, I couldn't stop searching for answers. To understand why I've spent more than a decade chasing shadows, you have to know who my mom was. Barbara wasn't perfect. None of us are. She was complicated, passionate, sometimes chaotic, and often larger than life. She could light up a room with her laugh, but she also carried struggles that weighed her down. She was a single mom raising me and my sister, Ollie. And she fought for us. She fought to give us love, to give us stability, even when her own life didn't always feel stable. She was also the glue, the person who kept birthdays alive, who made holidays matter, who reminded us that, no matter what else was happening, we were a family. And then, one morning, she was gone. Brutally, senselessly, stolen from us. That morning, March 3rd, I was just another 18-year-old college kid trying to balance classes and figuring out who I was. Then the phone rang. I was told my mom's body had been found in the yard of her own home. She had been brutally murdered. At first, it didn't compute. Murder wasn't something that happened in our neighborhood. This was Madison, Connecticut, a safe, affluent town where crime felt distant. Not the kind of place where your mom ends up dead on the grass. The news hit me like a wave that doesn't stop crashing. The details were horrifying. She had been attacked outside her home. The way she died was violent, personal. The kind of violence that suggests not a random stranger, but someone who knew her. And with that one thought, the nightmare deepened. Because in our family, there were secrets, grudges, and fractures. Suddenly, I had to wonder, could the person who killed my mother have been someone we knew? When the police arrived, everything was chaos. Neighbors whispering, news vans circling, officers pushing back onlookers. For a moment, it felt like the whole town had gathered outside my mother's house to watch tragedy unfold. The detectives asked questions, but their eyes seemed to hold more suspicion than compassion. It wasn't long before the investigation shifted inward, toward us, the family. They looked at my sister, Ollie. They looked at my aunt, Conway. They looked at my father, Jeffrey, even though he and my mom had divorced. Everyone close to her was suddenly under scrutiny. And that meant me, too. The detectives wouldn't share much, but what I pieced together was this. They believed the killer was someone my mom knew. Someone who had a motive. And in their eyes, that meant family. That realization didn't just hurt. It tore us apart. Because how do you grieve together when you're also being treated like suspects? The investigation revealed cracks in our family that most people never saw. My mother and father had divorced, and their relationship had been turbulent. Money, custody battles, anger, all of it left scars. My aunt, Conway, was my mom's sister. She had her own history with my mother, complicated and sometimes explosive. Even my sister, Ollie, was pulled into the shadow of suspicion. She was only 16 at the time, but the detectives still asked the kinds of questions no teenager should ever face. I remember watching the people I loved most sit under that cloud of suspicion, and feeling powerless. Instead of being able to grieve together, we were being pushed further apart. The police wanted answers, but they weren't giving us any. They wouldn't share their theories. They wouldn't tell us what evidence they had. Every time I asked, it felt like I was talking to a wall. And in that silence, rumors began to grow. The media swarmed in, and suddenly our private pain was public spectacle. I couldn't just sit there and accept what I was told, or rather, what I wasn't told. I needed to understand what had happened. Why would someone kill my mother? What did they gain? Who hated her enough to do this? And if the police weren't going to give me answers, then maybe I had to find them myself. That thought terrified me. I was just a kid. I didn't have training. I didn't know how to investigate a murder. But I had one thing the detectives didn't. I had my mother's story. I knew her life, her struggles, her enemies, her friends. And I was determined to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. That's where my journey began. When I started looking into my mother's life, I realized quickly that she carried more secrets than I ever imagined. There was the divorce from my father, Jeffrey. Their marriage had ended badly, full of tension over money, trust, and betrayal. My mom was fighting hard to regain stability, but the scars of that separation ran deep. Then there was my Aunt Conway. My mom and Conway's relationship was like fire and gasoline. They loved each other as sisters, but when they fought, it could get explosive. And beneath all of that was something even darker, whispers of a pyramid scheme, something called the gifting tables. My mom had been involved, like many women in our town. On the surface, it was pitched as a community of women helping women. But in reality, it was an illegal financial scheme that left many people angry and bitter. Some of those people had lost thousands of dollars. Some felt betrayed. And some had reasons to hate my mother. The deeper I dug, the more suspects I found. And yet, every new lead only raised more questions. I wanted to work with the detectives. I wanted to believe they cared as much about finding my mother's killer as I did. But the reality was different. Every time I asked questions, I got stonewalled. Ongoing investigation, they said. We can't share that information. Years passed, and still, nothing. No arrests. No answers. Just silence. What made it worse was the way they treated us, not as victims, but as suspects. They looked at me, my sister, my aunt, my father. They picked apart our stories, our lives, our motives. And all the while, the real killer walked free. It felt like the system had abandoned us. And in that vacuum, I realized I had two choices: let the case fade into cold obscurity, or fight to keep it alive. I chose to fight. At some point, I realized that if I was going to keep this story alive, I needed to document it. Not just for me, but for my family, and maybe even for justice. So I picked up a camera. I started filming conversations with my family, interviews with neighbors, footage of the places connected to my mom's life. It wasn't easy. Sitting down with my Aunt Conway, with my father, with people who were both loved ones and suspects in the eyes of police, it was like reopening wounds that never healed. Some family members refused to talk. Others lashed out. Every interview felt like walking a tightrope between truth and betrayal. But slowly, piece by piece, I began to build something bigger than myself, a record of my mother's life and death. A story that showed not just the crime, but the impact it left behind. That story became the foundation for what would one day air on HBO as Murder on Middle Beach. Filming those conversations came with a price. When you point a camera at someone and ask them to talk about murder, about suspicion, about family secrets, it changes your relationship forever. I asked my aunt questions that made her furious. I pressed my father about things he didn't want to discuss. I looked my own sister in the eye and asked her to relive the worst day of her life. Sometimes, I wondered if I was crossing a line, if I was exploiting my own family's pain. But then I'd remember why I was doing it, because the police weren't giving us answers. Because silence only let the truth fade further away. Every time the camera stopped rolling, I felt the weight of guilt. But I also felt something else, determination. If nobody else was going to tell this story, I would. When HBO got involved, everything changed. Suddenly, this wasn't just my personal project, it was a national story. The cameras got bigger. The stakes got higher. And the scrutiny became unbearable. Some people accused me of exploiting my mother's death. Others praised me for keeping the case alive. For my family, it was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the series brought renewed attention to my mom's murder. It forced people to look again at a case that had gone cold. But on the other hand, it reopened old wounds. It made my sister and my aunt relive things they wanted to forget. It put us under a spotlight we never asked for. The truth is, media is a double-edged sword. It can bring light to dark places, but it can also burn everyone it touches. One night, I sat down with an old friend who had once worked for the FBI. I told him about my struggles, about how the investigation was stuck, about how my family was falling apart, about how I feared I was exploiting my mom's memory just to keep her story alive. I asked him if all of this was worth it. And he asked me something I'll never forget. Would you rather find justice, or the truth? That question has haunted me ever since. Because the truth is, they're not always the same. Justice is a conviction, a verdict, a punishment. Truth is something messier. Truth is about understanding what happened, even if the courts never acknowledge it. What I've come to realize is that maybe I'll never see justice for my mom in the traditional sense. Maybe her killer will never be convicted. But if I can find the truth, if I can show the world who she was, and what was stolen from us, then maybe that's a kind of justice, too. It's been more than a decade since my mother's murder, and I'm still searching. The pain never goes away. The questions never stop. But neither does my determination. I tell this story not just for myself, but for anyone who's ever felt abandoned by the system, anyone who's ever been left waiting for answers that never come. My mom deserved better. My family deserved better. And while the investigation may remain unsolved, I refuse to let her memory fade into silence. This journey has cost me relationships. It has tested my faith. It has forced me to look at the people I love through the eyes of suspicion. But it has also taught me something vital. Sometimes, the truth itself is the only justice we'll ever get. And as long as I live, I'll keep searching for it.